We're so excited about this lecture series, and I will let Dr. Rami Nashashibi introduce our speaker, Dr. Umar Abdallah. I just want to welcome you to Chicago Theological Seminary. My name is Rabbi Rachel Mikva. I'm the chair in Jewish Studies here and the director of the Center for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Studies. The center builds bridges over religious difference through dialogue, engagement, education, and social justice collaboration among the peoples of the book. This is a unique gift to us that we wanted to share with the community in terms of the amazing scholarship to be offered in this series. To introduce our speaker, I'm very excited to announce, for those of you who don't already know, that Dr. Rami Nashashibi is going to be joining our faculty in the fall. He's already been an indispensable partner in all of our work here at the seminary. So please, Dr. Nashashibi, if you would introduce our speaker.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings be upon you, and shalom alaikum. For our Jewish brothers and sisters who are here, it's a happy Passover, Pesach, and I know the Jewish community is not unfamiliar with some of the same dynamics I think that exist in the Muslim community. So there's one contingent of the Jewish community that's holding out for another couple of minutes till sunset to formally announce the end of Passover. Again, it is an honor to have everyone here. I know many familiar faces that you're used to engaging me here through the context of Iman. As my colleague, Professor and Dr. Rabbi Rachel Mikva alluded to, I'm very excited and honored to be able to stop hopping around a bunch of universities on my side and finally accept a extraordinary appointment here at CTS. And I could think of no other institution that would be more naturally conducive to the fit between the type of work that have done and will continue to do as executive director at Iman with the type of extraordinary legacy that the CTS represents in terms of activism, relevant engagement with the faith tradition, with the issues of our time. So it's in that spirit that is an extraordinary honor to have Dr. Omar. As I was walking up, my colleague Rachel saddled me with the overwhelmingly extraordinary task of having to introduce Dr. Omar. I will not try to read from this because it is in front of all of you, and I encourage you to read this. I'll say one thing, and Dr. Thistlewaite, our colleague, mentioned by way of Ibu Butel, by way of Sheikh Hamza. In the Muslim community, we take Isnad traditions very seriously. That I think Sheikh Hamza had once reported that it was absolutely preordained that Dr. Omar would emerge as the extraordinary global scholar that he is, centered in America, in Chicago particularly. Because if he had been on either side of the country, the coasts would tip. And that is the weight of his knowledge. There's a tradition, a prophetic tradition. The prophet calls upon God as Ya Muqallib al-Qulub, Thabbit qalbi ala dinik. O you turner of hearts, make my heart thabit, firmly rooted in the tradition. I think if anyone has had even the most distant proximity to Dr. Omar, the attribute of a person that is rooted and makes you feel rooted, a person who is thabit and exudes that, for me, is the first thing I think of when I think of Dr. Omar. And again, it is just a profound, profound honor to have him here at CTS and to have him also teaching with us here in the fall as an adjunct. So, Dr. Omar Abdullah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. I begin in the name of God, the bestower of all-encompassing and infinite individual mercies. I'm very honored to be here tonight, and I'm very thankful to CTS and to Susan Thistlethwaite, Rachel, Rami, and all the others involved for giving us the opportunity to come here and to speak. I met Susan probably a day or two after September the 11th. And that was a very difficult time, as many of you remember. And the way that she stood up to help and to defend the Muslim community at large was very, very impressive, as did also other people in CTS and other people in other institutions around Chicago. So it's a great honor to be here. I also thank you for offering me the opportunity to give these 3 lectures, and then also, as Rami pointed out, I will be teaching a course, a graduate course in theology here next fall. So that's also something that I'm very thankful for, and I hope that we succeed in that. Also, my congratulations to my dear and old friend Rami, one of the prime movers of the Muslim community of Chicago and the United States, for the amazing work that he does, and I hope that this work will only continue to be greater and greater after his appointment here. So tonight we begin a series of 3 lectures called Perspectives in Muslim Theology. And the first lecture tonight is about theological foundations. In speaking about that, I want to talk first of all about how we got where we are, then where we are, and then third, where we ought to go, in my opinion. So we'll begin with the first part. I hope that we can get through before we have the break. We'll take a break and then come back and try to finish. If you like, we can ask questions right after resuming. That might be appropriate. And then resume the last part of the lecture and have questions after that. Feel very free to ask questions. And if the presentation is superficial for some of you, you can feel free to ask questions about any details that you like. So we begin by how did we get where we are? In the course of the 19th century, Western civilization cast the net of its powerful economic and political system over the entire world and caught all the living generations of humankind and all the habitable lands and navigable seas on the face of the earth. We changed the world, but the world changes us in turn. The monumental triumphs of colonial and post-colonial efforts in the West over the last 200 years or so have often proven imperfect and precarious. But whatever we may say about them, they have certainly been profound. In the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, one of the main hubs of which was right here in Midway Plaisance, where we stand today, newspapers of the city boasted, "All the world is here." But this was just a prelude to things that were about to come. Today, all of the world is continually here and remains here within us and even at our fingertips wherever we go. The powerful forces of globalism and its monoculture have brought all the different peoples and cultures of the world face to face in a manner that was unimaginable before, even in ancient Rome or in other subsequent global civilizations until the present time. The meeting and mixing of different peoples and cultures produces social, ideological, religious, and other types of ferment. In today's world, new religious movements are born every day. the rise of Christianity was affected and facilitated by the cosmopolitan ferment of the Roman Empire. When different peoples meet and mix, they instinctively need and even demand meaningful answers about the nature of the world they live in, who they are, what they are, and how and why they should relate to each other. Religions are supposed to answer such questions. When they are unable to do so, they generally fall to the wayside, while neo-religions, pseudo-religions, secular alternatives to religion, humanistic ideals and ideologies, and of course also resilient traditional religions vie with each other to take the lead. In the 19th century, as the Western world geared its global cultural offensive, directed primarily toward non-Western people, it inadvertently stimulated cultural counteroffensives in many of the civilizations it had brought under its domain. This happened among Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, and others. In the Muslim world, various types of reformers and apologists appeared who sought to bring about the kind of changes that they felt needed to be met. One of the amazing things is that most of these reformers, those of them who stood in awe of the West, and those of them who utterly rejected the West, most of these reformers were people who were convinced that Islam, as it was actually believed in and practiced by most of its followers, was not only mortally threatened by Western advances in thought, science, technology, and other fields, but they often felt that it was Islam's tradition which in fact was the reason for its demise. Many of them sought to institute a process of thoroughgoing reform that would once again reveal to the world, and especially to Muslims in that world, the original bright face of Islam. Times of crisis are not necessarily the best times to make decisions. Muslim reform movements, be they of rationalists or modernists or activists or idealists, or whoever they may have been, most of their activity was taken in a time of severe crisis, and in a time also when the understanding they had of the Western world was actually from a distance, even though the Western world was in their lands. But the nature of that civilization, the nature of the ideas that informed it, and the objectives that it had, that was actually not usually directly accessible to them. Many of them were spurred and goaded by a profound sense of crisis and of failure and of misunderstanding in the face of Western power, and the conviction that something in the Islamic tradition must have gone drastically wrong. Often, the mentalities of the reformers, as such, suffered from reductionism and oversimplification. They sought simple, clear-cut answers in a world that they imagined to be without great complexities, where everything should be black and white and there were no shades of gray. They generally wrote off the Islamic tradition, although that tradition had produced the great Islamic civilizations of the past, with their art and crafts and architecture, their science, their power, their economic wealth, the demise of which they so severely regretted. They pronounced much of Islam's traditional theology that we want to talk about a little bit tonight, its law as a product of classical schools, its rational ethics and psychology and spirituality, and especially the practice and the metaphysics of Sufism as unacceptable and unfortunate innovations that could not be identified with Islam in any true sense. At the same time, rarely did such Muslim reformers have much more than a very superficial understanding of the Western thought and the philosophical and other ideas, the debates that had gone on sometimes for hundreds of years in the West that underlay the science and the technology which they saw to be the driving force behind Western power and its economic wealth. They stood in awe of its material success. They stood in awe of the wealth and power that it had produced. And they rarely understood that the ideological background of this science and technology was something that had to be looked at very closely, and that it was not neutral, and that it could not be taken over without profound effects on themselves, on their environment, and on others. Many of them felt that if they just studied this science, and if they learned this technology, and of course we live in a community of Muslims here in Chicago and the United States, in which many of us are extremely capable in the sciences and medicine and technology, but almost never have we studied its philosophy or its background or understood that it has implications that come with it. For many of them, modernity and postmodernity, applied science and technology, they did not understand that they could not be successfully grafted upon the body of Islam, and in fact, that of humanity in general, like an artificial tail. Nor could they safely be integrated into their societies as long as there was not, first of all, a serious critique of them, and an examination of them, and an attempt to use the language of Islamic tradition to root them, to find the universal principles that make those forms of applied science and technology actual forms of knowledge and truth. They sought to come to terms with new challenges and realities, by taking them over from the West, and without also understanding that oftentimes this science and technology, these ideas, they have in them their own imperatives, their own drive that they take, which is very difficult for people to control and often very difficult to utilize in a way that produces benefit for all and avoids harm. How are we coming with time? Would this be a good place to stop? Okay. So that's the background of where we got to where we are. And would it be good to open up for questions here? Why don't we do that, and then we'll go pray, and we'll come back and resume after that. So do you have any questions you'd like to ask? Yes.
Dr. Omar, when you talk about Muslim reformers' response to kind of Western encroachment on Islamic civilization, are you talking about a particular region or perhaps was somewhat different from the response of Muslim reformers in West Africa during the 19th and 20th century?
Now, that's a very good point. That's a very good point because of the fact that in West Africa, especially in the work of people like Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, and also in the Sanusi movement of West Africa, you have a very, you could say, traditional response, and one that believed that the tradition was very much intact and that it had to be relied upon. Often those movements are regarded as pre-colonial. And of course, in the case of Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, one of the things that he does is to prepare West Africa, and especially what will become Nigeria, for the onslaught of colonialism. And although Nigeria went through immense difficulties when that occurred, nevertheless, the groundwork that Uthman Dan Fodio laid down was extremely important. So that's a very good point. What I'm really talking about is more the kind of reform that took place in Egypt and in India and other parts of the Muslim world, and it's quite complex, but especially the kind of things that you see in Sayyid Ahmed Khan and Muhammad Abdu. They are the ones, they very definitely believed that the tradition was of little use. And then out of that come other movements in the Arab world, in India, what will become Pakistan. But generally speaking, they share this view that we will start from scratch. Okay, so this is something that I want to talk about tonight, because I feel that we as Muslims in the United States, we have to take a broader view. We have to look at the tradition. We have to be able to tap into it.
Do you want to take another question before you
Okay.
Still have a question?
Was kind of related to that.
Okay. Or, well, a follow-up?
I was just curious in reference to the reformers themselves. Was this a homegrown movement where, with the colonialism, it allowed for this type of thinking to come forth, or was it actually imposed upon by the British?
In the case of most of the Muslim reformers, they may have had relations with the West. Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan did. He's called a Sir. And Muhammad Abdu did as well. But generally speaking, they are people who are part of the Muslim world, who at least outwardly are very proud of being part of that world, and who see that Muslims are in a huge conundrum. And I believe sincerely felt that something radical had to be done. And indeed, something radical does need to be done, because of the fact that in many cases the tradition as it had developed was not meeting the needs of the time. But the tradition itself is very rich. It had produced great civilizations that people like Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan were very proud of. And people like Muhammad Abdu were also very proud of. But the blanket rejection of the tradition and the desire to sort of start all over again, that's very problematic. And, people in all traditions, function best when there is continuity in what they do. Yes, Chris.
Thank you, Dr. Omar. As somebody who studies Muslim reformism, I agree and I appreciate your assessment, and I'm curious if you find anybody who really seems to be an exception to this rule that you've just mentioned, somebody who has had a rich and meaningful engagement with both the West in terms of its sciences as well as what we're calling the Islamic tradition.
Oh, first of all, do you have somebody in mind?
I have just started reading Iqbal, and I find him to be better than most. Although I don't have a deep appreciation.
Muhammad
of him.
Iqbal is definitely one of the outstanding figures. And again, in the case of Muhammad Iqbal, he takes it upon himself to try to learn about the way the West thinks. And in that, he studies the philosophy of the West in the 19th century. He was very influenced by Nietzsche, for example. And Iqbal is also profoundly affected by the poetic traditions and the religious traditions of Islam. Persian poetry, Urdu poetry, Arabic poetry. So the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam is a significant work. Again, his critique of modernity per se is something that we could take issue with. And interestingly, and this is one of the things that I'd like to look at in the fall, that some of the most interesting voices when it comes to talking about modernity are voices that come out of the West and that come primarily from converts in France, in Austria, in Germany, and who in some cases are extremely sophisticated. And in fact, those people, people like Muhammad Asad, people like René Guénon, Abdul Wahid Yahya, these are people who are able to grapple with Western thought, perhaps you could say as Westerners, and they are very concerned for the sake of humanity about certain aspects of what is happening in the Muslim world. We may or may not agree with all the things they write, and it's very important for us to be independent and to see where we stand. But these are interesting voices to look at. And in fact, directly or indirectly, a lot of these voices have very much influenced leading scholars among Muslims in the United States, Canada, and Europe. People like Abdul Hakim Murad Winter at Cambridge University. I'm not ascribing that they follow any of those people, but they are definitely aware of what those people have said. And that creates a discourse which I think is very important for us to be involved in. Okay, so we'll take a break now, and those who would like to get snacks, they can. And Rami, you take the rest.
There's a room set aside for the evening prayer on the second floor. Fazal can lead you down, or Rami can lead you down. Those of you who will not be praying, please stay and partake in the refreshments and each other's company, and we'll be sure to leave time for those who are praying to get a cup of coffee or whatever you would like before we reconvene around 10 after 8, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much.